So next presentation, we've got Rob Owens from eServe. Obviously, I mentioned earlier we're huge across a number of lenders. Rob is going to build on some of the data. Yeah, hold it, Rob. I saw you get ready there. Rob is going to build on some of the data that we've heard on this morning, but get into some of the minutiae around things like new build premium, new build flats and LTVs, amongst a raft of other things, Rob. So on that note, over to you.
First of all, thanks, Craig. As Craig was saying, I work for eServe, so I joined the company about 15 months ago now to head up the research and data function. It's an area that we're obviously looking to kind of dive into. And basically, it's been kind of a bit of a data geek's dream, loads of mortgage valuation data, and I'm kind of just breaking lots of new ground. And when Craig offered me this slot, it just meant I could really geek out and do some of the stuff that I didn't get to do in my old job. Right, let's have a look. Narrative, it's kind of there, but there's a bit of jumping around, especially in those early slides, just because it's the coolest stuff. So, first slide really, just to kind of state where we are today. So what I'm looking at here is EPCs for new builds, lodged fantastic data set from DLUHC, weekly updates. And what we're doing is we're comparing by year from 2019 up to year to date. And you can see, broadly speaking, 2023 has been pretty good. It's kind of been in line with 2019, 2020, as a lot of the speakers have kind of said, you know, it feels like we're in that 2018, 2019 kind of holding pattern. I guess what's interesting though, just in the last week, or two, you can see that there has been a bit of a divergence there. So we are on track roughly to complete around 250,000 homes for the year, which feels like a win. But we are starting to see perhaps that slowdown, which obviously a lot of builders have kind of been warning us about over the last probably 6 months or so. So just kind of where we are, and again, just basically saying, you know, it's not been too bad for builders in 2023 so far. And then the second one really, as I was saying, this is kind of a new build premium one, and Alex kind of mentioned this earlier. At the HBF conference, I believe that there was a presentation where a chap kind of outlined the new build premium being kind of reaching up to 46%. And I think everyone in the room kind of gasped. Craig obviously kind of came back to me and said, can we have a look at our data? And this is my interpretation. So what we're looking at here is the new build premium for a 3-bed home. The dark line is obviously new build, and then the pink line is resale. And then the area chart underneath is the percentage change. So we're looking at the right-hand side axis here, and you can see, broadly speaking, from 2019, we've kind of been there or thereabouts. It's kind of 10 to 15%. I think, as Alex mentioned in his presentation, though, during that pandemic period, there was a bit of the premium obviously kind of was eroded. And I think, you know, I guess anecdotally, I can't say for certain, but it was obviously during a period of very strong forward sales, so kind of prices were locked in. But then you also had the resale market going like the clappers. So essentially it was kind of catching up as the race for space kind of happened. And what we've seen kind of since moving into 2022 is obviously it's started to recover. So what this chart's showing is the area chart. You can see it's kind of around 13% as of this month. I guess the other interesting thing really is just how settled those lines have been. So, you know, we're around 2,500. We've kind of just fallen, or we're just above 3,000 now. And similarly, you can just see those lines just track each other. And it's really important, I think, you know, when you're looking at new build, it's a subset of the whole market. You know, it's 10%, 15% of the market. So a lot of the answers are in the resale data as well. But next slide. And what we're doing here is just to kind of drive home the point around new build premium. We're now looking at the data regionally. So we've still got the pounds per square foot. And hopefully there's no surprises here, but you know, what we're seeing is typically the areas in the northeast, Scotland, Wales, Yorkshire, you know, it's around 30%. I think northeast is 43%. Typically, you know, it's a slightly different product, especially in places like the northeast and Scotland. What we're seeing is larger kind of 4-bed executive homes. And then, you know, and that supply of stock just means that essentially the premium is huge because of the supply constraints for those kinds of properties. As we kind of move to the right-hand side of the chart, though, we can start to see that it normalizes a little bit. So it's kind of that 15% sweet spot that we were looking on the chart, where London, the East, Southwest and the Southeast all kind of bubbling around 10%. I think London is just 9%. So, and just for clarity here, London, I've done it for 2-bed flats. Everything else is 3-bed houses, just to normalise the data. I think that HBF chart, I think, was kind of non-weighted. So it was kind of apples and oranges. It wasn't quite right, hence why you had a very punchy premium kind of arrive through the horizon. And then next, down valuations. So again, this is a chart I wouldn't have been able to share in my former life, but now I've kind of got the keys to the sweet shop. I've been able to bring it out. So a down valuation occurs obviously when a mortgage lender values a property at less than the buyer is agreed to pay. And essentially what I've done is I've taken a 5-year average, and that 5-year average for down valuations at eServe is around 6%. And then I've essentially indexed the data. So this is relative to that 6%. And you can see kind of there are some peaks, and those peaks typically kind of correspond with things like the end of Help to Buy, where we started to see kind of a rise in supply coming to market. And then obviously kind of as we move to the right of the chart again, obviously things like the rising interest rates of the mini budget and kind of growing economic uncertainty as well. I guess what's interesting though is that's kind of, we've almost put that behind us over the last kind of 6 months or so. And you can see right now the current position is we're actually kind of slightly below the 5-year average. It's around, I think we're about 97%, 95% of the 5-year average, which is pretty good. And next, what we're looking at here really is, again, another thing that I've now got access to, so very excited, is buyer incentives, and looking at the number of new build transactions that we've seen in quarterly increments with and without incentives. So if we start at the top there, we're kind of around the beginning of 2020, we were looking at around 50–60%. It obviously starts to fall during the pandemic as that demand starts to come through, not just in the just across the sales market in general, and that kind of starts to drop down into, 40%, 43%, I think. And then we've started to see kind of the use of incentives begin to rise again. Obviously, with the economic uncertainty and the rise of interest rates, it's about greasing the wheels. It's quite interesting. I think we actually kind of get to see the value, we get to see the value of the incentive as well. And we also run a sentiment survey with our surveyor workforce. And typically we're starting to see that incentive, the value of the incentive rise. So up to that 5% threshold. And that's kind of been over the last 2 or 3 months. I think at this point here, kind of in the middle of the chart, I was looking at the data. Some poor person who got the incentive, vacuum cleaner and 100 quid John Lewis voucher. What we're seeing now is probably more deposit contributions, stamp duty, legals, the stuff at kind of almost the beginning of the transaction to kind of grease the wheels a little bit and get those first-time buyers onto the ladder. So what we can do now is, now we're just basically, what I've done is essentially a word search. So I've taken all the data and tried to distill it down to kind of the key incentives that we've seen over the last 3-month window, I think. So as I say, deposit contribution, we're seeing that at 27%. And you've got to remember incentives, it can be a combination. So the guy with the Hoover and the voucher, it could be it could be a deposit contribution, it could be legal fees paid, it could be a combination of 3, 4, 5 of these potentially. But what we're seeing, as I say, is those top 3 there, I think are the ones to call out: deposit contribution, the stamp duty paid, legal fees paid. Upgraded specs, the white goods, that was kind of that 2021 kind of COVID period. That's typically what we were seeing in terms of incentives, and that's kind of started to drift away a bit. I guess what also that stands out here is, the breadth really, but just how little they've contributed over the last 3 months, I think is quite interesting. And just moving more into kind of buyer sentiment and kind of the sentiment we're generally seeing. So hopefully some of you have seen our recent Property Watch report. We've just reactivated it. Essentially 500 surveyors, our eServe kind of operational workforce. We asked them to complete a monthly survey, and essentially, it's I'll hold my hands up. It's a bit similar to the RICS, but on steroids. So we've kind of obviously been able to kind of flesh it out a little bit. So what we're looking at here is basically the size and the shares of markets that our surveyors are seeing at a local level, aggregated up to UK level, and whether they're seeing rises, falls, or kind of the buyer demand pool of buyers is roughly the same. So kind of at an overall level, what we're seeing essentially is, the market has been pretty steady month to month, around 73%. Small kind of, roughly 25%, a quarter of kind of is falling, but that kind of feels right based on what we've heard today. I think what's interesting is when you start to break it out by buyer group, again, downsizer, so those older equity-rich or cash-rich buyers, are doing pretty well for themselves. So you can see that, around 11% of our surveyors are seeing a rise in that activity, that buyer activity for that audience. Home movers and first-time buyers are relatively kind of, they're in the same ballpark, which makes sense. Obviously, first-time buyers perhaps have more challenges in terms of gathering that deposit, but, is what it is. And then lastly, investors. So again, buy-to-let, those investors, probably smaller investors, those who have to use finance for their purchases, are obviously having a very hard time right now with buy-to-let mortgages, and that's just reflected in the data. So we are kind of seeing, some reluctance, especially amongst those amateur landlords, in terms of what they do next. Should they be exiting, I think, or are they going to kind of try to stick around for a little bit, or maybe consolidate their portfolio where possible? And just focusing on that first-time buyer audience, that's obviously been a key theme today in terms of how do we kind of try to get first-time buyers, moving and on the ladder. Again, another part of our surveyor survey, and this is, I think, coming out next week, probably this time next week, is we asked our surveyors to kind of give any, what are the main trends that they're seeing from first-time buyers in terms of how they're getting on the housing ladder. And I guess what's interesting here is we've split it by London and the UK, and you can see that the UK is fairly evenly spread. So you can see it's kind of around, between 10 and 15% across the piece. So that's things like increasing demand for smaller properties, growing interest in shared ownership and affordable home ownership schemes, considering, less expensive parts of town, so that migration piece that Alex was talking about earlier, the extension of mortgage terms to beyond 30 years. So, you can see that obviously in the UK finance data, increased support from the Bank of Mum and Dad, which is kind of almost an evergreen one, more likely to buy a new build property, more likely to buy a second-hand property. And I guess what's interesting, obviously, with the UK being so evenly spread, you can really see the concentrations from a London perspective, how it differs. So shared ownership obviously helped to buy. That 40% equity loan was, such a lever for getting people into home ownership. So it's perhaps no surprise that, Londoners and probably those in the immediate commuter belt are looking, kind of resetting their boundaries and perhaps looking at those schemes. And also, again, as I say, Bank of Mum and Dad, obviously a huge one for London and the surrounding commuter belt. Again, this is using our Property Watch data set, and essentially what we've asked here is our valuers, our valuers, I guess. What we're asking here is essentially what's the most common type of property, or what are the top 3 most common types of property that you're seeing first-time buyers look at over the last couple of months. And the colour coding is a bit funky, but bear with me. The teal one are obviously the new build ones. The darker ones are resale. So you can already see that perhaps there's greater consideration for resale properties. Sorry, Craig. And then new build as well. So we've got some new build and it kind of flexes up and down. But I think for me, as Peter was saying earlier, in terms of Help to Buy and that overbuying and getting there a bit quicker, for me, this does kind of point towards perhaps, you know, a slight managing of expectation from first-time buyers. So we can see that, you know, it's 2 beds, 1 beds, 2 beds, and that's across the piece. So it's not an affordability issue kind of purely in London. It's a bit more widespread. So you can see that I think people are being more pragmatic, especially first-time buyers. They are looking at smaller properties, perhaps, as they start to kind of factor in that decreased buying power. And, you know, I guess from a new build perspective is how do we kind of make that change, that mix, almost coming back from the 3 or 4 bed property we were selling by the bucket load with Help to Buy, how do we kind of manage that back down to a 2 or 3 bed property, which seems to be more realistic and more in keeping with what perhaps first-time buyers should be doing? I don't know. And then lastly, again, part of the survey, it's obviously that time of year where a lot of the research folk stick their neck out on the line and try and kind of tell you where house prices are going to go over the next 12 months, 3 years. And I think we've taken a slightly different approach. Again, we've asked our surveyor workforce, you know, these are 500 you know, industry experts, subject matter experts in their area. So hopefully it seems to make sense to me. So you can see, you know, over the next 3 months, it feels like the market will be broadly where it is today. 6 months again, 12 months starting to see those kind of green shoots of recovery, partly through hopefully mortgage rates, interest rates coming down a little bit, people starting to feel, you know, well, hopefully that buying power is slightly increasing, that, you know, that, well, hopefully, you know, spring budget, even more, more giveaways, more things to kind of grease the wheels in terms of the market. And then lastly, that 3-year one there. So you can see that our workforce thinks, over half of our workforce thinks that, you know, in 3 years' time, you know, markets will be rising. At what level? I can see James is looking. Sorry, James, I had to try. I had to put this one in, but yeah, we shouldn't be calling the market, so please don't look at it. But yeah, it feels realistic to me. It feels like a sensible kind of managed approach to what the housing market may look like in 2 to 3 years' time. And I think, you know, I think that's where we're heading in terms of probably price growth. It is low single digits probably for quite a long time. 2 to 3 years feels about right to me. Lastly, just those key takeaways. So kind of new build pricing completions, they have remained pretty steady over the last 12 months, pretty resilient. The supply of new homes, obviously likely to fall. So that EPC chart that we were looking at earlier, and obviously, you know, a lot of the chat we've heard today has seemed to suggest that as, you know, that developers are looking to manage that supply and demand kind of narrative. Increased buyer incentives. So again, as we saw in the chart, it does look like the buyer incentives are being pitched at the beginning to kind of address those deposit hurdles, those legals, those stamp duty kind of hurdles. And then lastly, you know, first-time buyers are obviously a huge audience for developers. I think the quote, you know, we've all kind of mentioned that 40–50% of first-time buyers using Help to Buy or being responsible for new build sales. How do we kind of get back in touch with that audience over the next few years? I think that's me done. So thank you for your time.
Just before Rob steps down, one of the things that it came up at a New Homes collaboration meeting that I run with a number of the people in this room, sort of in between the forums, just to keep the dialogue going, was around new build flats, you know, obviously particularly relevant in this part of the country. And that for years, it's almost like we've got to a point of accepting that most lenders cap out at 75–80%. There are some lenders that will go up to 90%, I know, but very few. what I know you've done some research on this, Rob. Is perhaps one we can share with the lender parties after this event? But what's the key messages around that at the moment? How are new build flats performing?
I think I guess the challenge we had with new build flats was from the financial crisis, and I think obviously a lot of people had their fingers burnt by that. I guess what was interesting about that time was, if you look at the new build completions by property type, it was around 45-50% were flats. We were overweight in flats. Perhaps we were building them in the wrong communities as well. Perhaps, you know, there was a lot of buy-to-let money that obviously unregulated mortgages, people were running in to buy those flats and obviously had some issues selling. And I think that's obviously scared off lenders. I think when you look at the market today, I guess there are a couple of things that are interesting. I think obviously we've moved back to a more traditional number of completions of flats being built annually. So I think it's around 20-30%, which is, you know, where it has been long run. I guess the other thing to think about as well, which so I've done these slides for a few clients now. It's been a very popular question over the last probably 6 to 9 months. Is if you look at the recovery time. So if you take flats and houses and basically take their 2007 peak, and then obviously the financial crisis happens, prices drop. How long did it take for prices to come back? When you do that analysis, it's not too bad. It's about 12 to 18 months, which doesn't feel as scary as perhaps some of the folk thought when we were presenting that research. And I think I'll probably give you one last one as well, if you want. Okay, cool.
30 seconds.
All right, yeah. House price indices, if you again break it out by flats and start just before Grenfell, well, maybe 12 to 18 months before Grenfell, what you see is the indices by type were all kind of going together. Grenfell happens, obviously a huge amount of uncertainty, it flatlines. The second one, or the second trough, is that it starts to catch up. You then come to the space race, COVID, it drops off again. But if you look over probably the last 6 months or so, you're starting to see flats come back, probably because, you know, there's a lot of value in flats and it keeps on coming back to affordability.
Yeah. Okay, sorry, Rob, I put you on the spot there. So thank you for your honest appraisal. So, Rob, thank you for your time.
Thank you.